January 22, 1944. Anzio, Italy. The beachhead is 16 miles wide and 7 miles deep, and every inch of it is within range of German artillery. Private First Class Jack Bradley, U.S. Army medic, 3rd Infantry Division, is moving through an open field under fire. There are 4 wounded men in front of him. No cover, no support. The nearest aid station is 300 yards behind him. He is alone. His commanding officers had already written off the exposed positions. Too hot. Too open. The math didn't work. 1 medic, no armor, no escort. The calculation was simple. Bradley didn't run the same math. What happened over the next several hours at Anzio wouldn't make headlines. It wouldn't be announced over a radio. It wouldn't be discussed at a command briefing. But the men who were there, the ones who made it back, they knew exactly what 1 medic had done in that field. This is the account of what happened. All of it. Jack Bradley wasn't the kind of soldier that military planners built campaigns around. He held no officer's commission. He commanded no unit. He gave no orders and attended no strategy briefings. His rank, Private First Class, placed him near the bottom of the U.S. Army's formal hierarchy. His role, combat medic, placed him in a category that most infantrymen respected in theory and ignored in practice. Medics were support personnel. They followed the fight. They didn't shape it. Bradley was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division, one of the most combat-hardened American divisions in the entire European theater. The 3rd had already pushed through North Africa and Sicily before setting foot on Italian soil. Its infantrymen were not easily impressed. They had seen enough action to develop a precise and unsentimental opinion of who was useful under fire and who wasn't. Medics, in their estimation, were useful. Up to a point. That point ended where the open ground began. Within the division, Bradley was not a name anyone tracked. He was 23 years old. He had come up through the standard Army medical training pipeline. Basic field medicine, triage protocols, wound stabilization, litter carry procedures. Nothing in his paperwork separated him from the dozens of other combat medics rotating through the division's forward positions. If a senior officer had been asked to name him, it's unlikely they could have. What his paperwork didn't show, and what his peers had no particular reason to notice, was how Bradley had spent the months before deployment. While other soldiers used their limited downtime to rest or stay clear of anything resembling extra work, Bradley had been studying terrain. Not maps in the formal sense, though he used those too, but the actual physical logic of contested ground. He watched how stretcher bearers moved. He watched where they slowed down. He watched where they stopped entirely. He began to understand that the geography of a battlefield had its own grammar, and that most people operating on it were reading only the surface. He also trained his body in ways that weren't required. Extended carries, movement under load over broken ground, repeated rehearsals of extraction routes in low light. None of this was assigned. None of it was graded. His fellow medics noted it with the mild curiosity people reserve for behavior they don't understand and don't intend to imitate. One account from a soldier in his unit, recorded after the war, described Bradley around this period as quiet, to the point of making you wonder what he was thinking. It wasn't a compliment. In the informal culture of a combat unit, silence reads as either depth or detachment, and the men around Bradley hadn't yet had reason to determine which. His supervising medical officer considered him competent, thorough, reliable in the way that unremarkable soldiers are reliable, present, procedurally correct, unlikely to cause problems. There was no formal criticism of Bradley's performance in the lead-up to Anzio. There was also no particular recognition of it. He existed in the middle space that institutions create for people they haven't yet been forced to evaluate. What his peers didn't know, and wouldn't have cared much about if they had, was that Bradley had quietly studied the casualty reports coming out of the Italian campaign with a focus that went beyond professional interest. He wasn't reading them for statistics. He was reading them for patterns. Specifically, he was tracking the gap. The time between when a soldier went down and when a medic reached him. He was measuring how often that gap was the difference between survival and a body bag. In most cases, it was. The standard operating approach to casualty extraction in contested zones was conservative by design. Medics advanced when conditions permitted. When conditions didn't permit, they waited. The logic was sound: a dead medic helps no one. Preserve the asset. Extract when safe. The doctrine had been written by men who understood that combat medicine was a resource, and resources had to be managed. Bradley understood the doctrine. He had memorized it, in fact. He simply wasn't certain it was right. This wasn't a position he stated out loud. He didn't argue with instructors or challenge senior medics during briefings. He kept the disagreement where it lived, inside his own assessment of the problem, and continued running his extractions, filing his reports, and maintaining the professional surface that the Army required of him. By the time the 3rd Infantry Division received its orders for Operation Shingle, the amphibious landing at Anzio, Bradley was one of hundreds of medical personnel attached to the operation. Experienced eyes across the division looked at the tactical plan, looked at the terrain, and arrived at the same conclusion. The beachhead would be a killing ground. One medic looked at the same information and arrived at a different question entirely. Not whether men would fall in that open ground, but whether anyone would go out to bring them back. And when the landing came, and the killing ground revealed itself for exactly what it was, Bradley's question stopped being theoretical. The Allied landing at Anzio on January 22, 1944, achieved tactical surprise. That was the last thing that went according to plan. Operation Shingle had been conceived as a flanking maneuver, a bold amphibious strike behind German lines that would force Field Marshal Albert Kesselring to pull his forces back from the Gustav Line further south, opening the road to Rome. On paper, the logic was clean. In execution, it collapsed within days. The Allied forces landed largely unopposed. The beachhead was established, and then nothing. The commanding officer, U.S. Major General John P. Lucas, chose consolidation over exploitation. He dug in rather than pushed forward. It was a decision that would be debated by military historians for decades. What it meant on the ground in January 1944 was this: the Germans were given time to respond. Kesselring responded with everything he had. Within 72 hours of the landing, German forces had sealed the beachhead on 3 sides. Artillery was repositioned on the high ground surrounding Anzio, the Alban Hills to the northeast, giving German gunners an unobstructed line of sight across virtually the entire Allied position. What had briefly been an open corridor became a compressed, exposed killing ground, roughly 16 miles wide and 7 miles deep. Every road, every field, every supply route was within range of German guns. The shelling was not random. German artillery commanders had studied the terrain before the Allies arrived. They had pre-registered their guns on key coordinates: crossroads, open fields, likely assembly areas. When Allied units moved into those positions, the Germans didn't need to search for them. They already knew where the shells needed to land. Allied infantry began, taking casualties at a rate that the medical system was not structured to absorb. The problem wasn't the number of medics. The 3rd Infantry Division had adequate medical personnel by standard Army tables of organization. The problem was geography. The beachhead's terrain, flat, open, stripped of natural cover by winter, turned casualty extraction into a tactical problem that the standard approach couldn't solve. The doctrine said, advance when safe, extract when conditions permit. On the Anzio beachhead, conditions rarely permitted. Men went down in open ground. Medics assessed the situation, calculated the exposure, and in many cases made the correct institutional decision. Wait. The fire was too heavy. movement would draw more fire. Better to hold and extract when the situation changed. The situation, in the early weeks at Anzio, did not change. Men who went down in exposed positions stayed down. Some survived long enough to be extracted when darkness came. Others didn't. The casualty reports that accumulated through the first week of the beachhead told a story that no one at the command level wanted to read directly, but that every medical officer understood. Men were dying, not from their wounds, but from the time between the wound and the treatment. The gap that Bradley had been tracking in the casualty reports from Sicily and mainland Italy, that gap was now appearing on every page. The standard medical response to this problem was escalation of the same approach. More medics pushed forward, evacuation timing adjusted, triage protocols reviewed. The system examined itself, found its procedures sound, and continued operating within them. The results did not improve. German snipers and artillery observers had begun to recognize patterns in Allied casualty extraction. When a soldier went down, they watched. When a medic moved toward the position, they watched that too. The red cross markings on a medic's helmet and armband were supposed to confer protected status under the Geneva Convention. On the Anzio beachhead, that protection was inconsistently honored at best. Medics moving into exposed positions under fire were drawing fire themselves. 2 medics from forward units in the 3rd Division had already been wounded in the first week of operations. 1 was killed. The institutional response to medic casualties was predictable, and from a resource management perspective, rational. Pull medical personnel back from the most exposed positions. Protect the asset. The guidance came down through the chain informally, the way guidance often does when it can't be written as an order, as an understanding, a suggestion, an implied preference. Don't advance into positions where you'll become a casualty yourself. The effect of that guidance was felt immediately in the forward positions. Soldiers who went down in the most exposed ground now had no expectation of extraction. They knew where the medics were. They knew how far back the safe line ran. If they fell on the wrong side of it, they did the math themselves. The math was not in their favor. Morale in the forward units began to show the strain, not in any way that appeared in official reports. Unit cohesion held, and the 3rd Division soldiers continued to fight with the discipline the division was known for. But the men talked. They always talked. And what they said, in the specific vocabulary soldiers use for things that frighten them, was this: if you go down out there, you stay down. That statement, passed from foxhole to foxhole across the Anzio beachhead in the first weeks of February 1944, was not a rumor. It was an operational reality. And it was the problem that no one in the command structure had yet found a way to solve. But one man had been watching all of it, measuring it. And somewhere in that calculation, Jack Bradley had stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. The Germans were not passive observers. That was the assumption some units had quietly made in the early days of the beachhead, that the enemy's attention was fixed on larger tactical problems, on supply lines and troop movements and the Allied positions along the Gustav Line to the south. That German artillery and sniper teams were operating on fixed patterns, predictable and mechanical, not watching and adjusting. That assumption did not survive February 1944. By the second week of the month, German forward observers positioned in the Alban Hills had begun compiling something more deliberate than targeting data. They were building a behavioral map of the Allied beachhead. Every pattern of movement, every predictable response to a casualty, every route a stretcher team used more than once. All of it was being logged and fed back into the German fire plan. The Germans had noticed Bradley, not by name, not yet. But they had noticed the pattern. A single figure, moving into exposed ground after soldiers fell. Moving faster than a standard extraction. Was heaviest, this pattern kept appearing. Wherever the fire was heaviest, this pattern kept appearing. And wherever this pattern appeared, wounded men were coming off the field. The German response was methodical. The first adjustment was timing. Sniper teams and artillery observers began implementing a tactic that veterans of the Eastern Front had already refined against Soviet medics: the follow-up shot. A soldier's hit, he goes down in an exposed position. The shooter waits. Not for the fallen man, he's already a casualty. The shooter waits for whoever comes next. The logic was coldly efficient. One round creates a casualty. The follow-up creates a problem. A medic down in the open is now himself a casualty requiring extraction, compounding the original problem and drawing further resources into the kill zone. Bradley had understood this tactic existed. What changed in February was the precision with which it was being applied against him specifically. The intervals shortened. In the early weeks, Bradley had been able to use the natural pause after a soldier went down, a brief window in which German fire shifted or recalibrated, to move into the open and begin an extraction. That window had existed because German observers were not yet focused on his movement pattern. They were focused on the unit, on the broader position, on the tactical situation. Now they were focused on him. The window shrank from minutes to seconds. Where Bradley had previously been able to move 40 or 50 yards into open ground before fire adjusted to his position, he was now drawing accurate fire within the first 10 or 15 yards of movement. The margin between a successful extraction and a failed one, between Bradley returning to cover with a wounded man and Bradley becoming a casualty himself, had been cut by more than half. He adapted. He had to. The first adaptation was route variation. Bradley stopped using the same approach lines twice. On flat, open terrain with limited natural features, this required a level of spatial memory and pre-mission analysis that most people operating under fire do not have the bandwidth to execute. Before each movement, Bradley was now calculating not just the fastest route to the casualty, but the least predictable one. The line that a German observer, watching his previous movements, would be least likely to have pre-registered. He was running probability assessments under fire, in real time, with incomplete information. The second adaptation was timing. Bradley began studying the rhythm of German fire. Artillery and sniper operations, even highly disciplined ones, have patterns, reload cycles, observer rotation. The brief, predictable moments when a position goes quiet, not because the threat has ended, but because the mechanism of the threat is momentarily occupied elsewhere. Bradley learned to read those moments. He began moving not when the ground looked safe, but when the fire pattern told him there was a narrow interval of reduced exposure. This was no longer a physical problem. It had become an intelligence problem. Each extraction required Bradley to process incoming information: the location of the casualty, the direction of fire, the behavior of German observers, the terrain between his position and the man on the ground, and produce a decision within seconds that carried a zero tolerance for error. The physical demands hadn't decreased. The distance was the same. The weight of a wounded man hadn't changed. The ground was still open, still flat, still offering nothing in the way of cover. But now, layered on top of all of that, was an enemy that had studied him and was actively engineering the conditions of his failure. And the casualties kept coming. The beachhead didn't contract. The forward positions didn't pull back. Men continued to fall in the same exposed ground. They had been falling in since the first week of the landing. The tactical situation had not improved. If anything, the German cordon had tightened through February, increasing the frequency and accuracy of fire across the entire Allied position. Bradley was running more extractions, not fewer, in worse conditions against an enemy that was now specifically accounting for him. The physical and cognitive load had compounded to a point that would have justified, by any reasonable institutional standard, a reduction in operational tempo, a step back, a reassessment. Bradley did not step back, but even he could not have anticipated what the Germans were preparing to do next, because adapting to one man's movement patterns was only the first part of their response. The second part was designed to make the entire problem disappear. By late February 1944, the Germans had stopped trying to simply outrun Bradley. They had decided to outthink him. The shift was subtle enough that it might have gone unnoticed by someone operating on instinct alone. A soldier goes down. A medic moves. Fire adjusts. The cycle had become familiar. Brutal, but familiar. What began appearing in the forward positions during the third week of February was something different. Something that didn't fit the established rhythm. Soldiers were going down in positions that didn't make tactical sense. Not in the open ground where most casualties fell. The exposed fields and cratered approaches that both sides understood as kill zones. These casualties were appearing in partially covered positions, near broken walls, at the edge of drainage ditches, in spots that offered just enough visual obstruction to suggest from a distance that a medic moving toward them might have a reasonable chance of reaching them without full exposure. The positions looked survivable. That was the point. German forward observers had studied the terrain with the same methodical attention they had applied to Bradley's movement patterns. They had identified the locations on the beachhead where a wounded man would appear reachable, where the geometry of the ground would create the impression of a viable extraction route. They had pre-registered their guns on the approaches to those locations, and then they had placed their casualties there deliberately, timing the engagements to produce wounded men in exactly the positions most likely to compel a response. They were manufacturing targets. The bait was a wounded soldier. The trap was the ground between Bradley and that soldier. And the trigger, the thing that would close the trap, was Bradley's own pattern of response, which the Germans had spent 3 weeks learning well enough to predict. The first time this tactic appeared, Bradley moved. He had assessed the position, read the terrain, identified what looked like a workable approach line. He was 20 yards into the open when the fire came, not from the direction his route analysis had flagged as the primary threat, but from a secondary position he hadn't weighted heavily enough. The rounds landed close. He dropped, changed direction, used a shallow depression in the ground that wasn't on any map but was there, and he moved through it on his elbows for 30 yards before the angle of fire shifted enough to give him a route forward. He reached the man. He extracted him. But the margin had been razor thin, thinner than anything he had operated within before. And when Bradley returned to cover and ran the sequence back through his mind, he recognized what had happened. The position hadn't been an accident. The approach geometry had been engineered. Someone on the German side had looked at the ground from his perspective and built a problem specifically designed for the way he moved. He sat with that information for a long time before he acted on it. The second instance came 2 days later. Different position, same signature. A casualty in ground that looked accessible. Bradley studied it for longer than usual. Long enough that another medic nearby asked if he was going to move. Bradley didn't answer. He kept watching. He was looking not at the casualty, but at the ground surrounding the casualty, at the lines of sight, at the places where a secondary observer would have to be positioned to make the geometry of the trap work. He found it, a position 200 yards to the northeast, partially concealed, that would have been outside his threat assessment if he'd run a standard approach analysis. It was the anchor point for the secondary fire. Without it, the trap didn't close. Bradley didn't move toward the casualty. He moved laterally, parallel to his original route, adding 40 yards to his exposure time, but removing himself from the secondary fire's optimal engagement window. He reached the man from an approach angle the trap hadn't been built to cover. The fire came anyway, late and from the wrong angle to be accurate. He extracted the soldier and placed at distances that increased Bradley's time in the open, and therefore the number of adjustments he'd need to make mid-movement. Each iteration was a tighter problem. Each iteration left less room for the kind of lateral thinking that had gotten him through the previous one. The timing pressure compounded everything. A wounded man in the open was not a static problem. Every minute Bradley spent analyzing the trap was a minute the casualty was bleeding. The calculus was punishing. Move too fast and walk into an engineered kill zone. Move too slow, and the man on the ground dies before you reach him. There was no version of this that didn't cost something. Bradley began making decisions that he could not fully justify in the moment. Reads on terrain and fire patterns that were operating below the level of conscious analysis, built from weeks of accumulated observation that had no formal name and appeared in no training manual. He was running the problem faster than he could explain it, trusting outputs that came from somewhere he couldn't quite locate. Most of the time, the outputs were right. The consequences, when they were slightly wrong, were immediate and physical. Around through the aid bag. Dirt thrown into his face, by an impact close enough to leave him briefly unable to see. A near miss that he documented in no report and mentioned to no one, because there was nothing to say about it that the situation didn't already make obvious. He was being hunted with increasing precision by an enemy that had made him a specific priority, and he was still going out. But the Germans had one move left. And it wasn't aimed at Bradley's body. It was aimed at the one thing that had kept him functional through all of it: his ability to choose when and how he moved. The morning of February 28, 1944 began quietly. On the Anzio beachhead, quiet was never the absence of danger. It was a different configuration of it. The shelling had eased overnight, not because the Germans had pulled back, but because their artillery crews were rotating and resupplying. The forward positions of the 3rd Infantry Division held their ground in the gray pre-dawn light, and the men in the foxholes did what soldiers do in brief quiet. They ate, they checked their equipment, and they watched the ground in front of them with the specific, exhausted attention of people who have learned that what they don't see is usually more dangerous than what they do. At approximately 8 a.m., a soldier went down 70 yards northeast of Bradley's forward position. Bradley saw it happen. He noted the location, the body position, the direction of the shot. He noted the time, and then he didn't move. This was not hesitation. It looked like hesitation from the outside. The other medic positioned 20 yards to Bradley's left started to rise. Bradley put a hand out without looking at him. "Stay." The other medic stayed, more out of surprise than compliance, and watched Bradley do something that made no immediate sense. Bradley watched the ground, not the casualty. The casualty was a known quantity, a wounded man in a specific position at a specific distance. That problem was fixed. What Bradley was watching was everything surrounding that fixed problem. The broken stone wall 180 yards to the north. The shallow rise in the terrain 220 yards to the northeast that looked at a casual glance like undifferentiated ground, but sat at exactly the elevation an observer would need to cover the most direct approach to the casualty. The drainage line running southeast that offered the only natural cover on the approach, and therefore the only route a medic moving quickly would instinctively use. He had seen this geometry before. Not this exact configuration. The Germans were disciplined enough to vary their setups, but the underlying logic was identical to the traps he had worked through in the preceding 2 weeks. The casualty position had been engineered. The most accessible approach route ran directly through pre-registered ground. The secondary fire position was the rise to the northeast. The drainage line wasn't cover. It was a channel that would funnel him into the optimal engagement window for a shooter he hadn't yet fully located. Bradley spent 7 minutes on this assessment. 7 minutes is a long time when a man is bleeding in the open. Every second of those 7 minutes existed as a weight that the situation was applying to Bradley's decision-making. The accumulated urgency of a wounded soldier, the instinct to move, the fear that analysis was costing the man his life. The Germans knew this weight existed. They had designed the trap around it. The entire architecture of the setup depended on Bradley feeling the pressure of time and allowing that pressure to shorten his assessment and push him into movement before he had fully read the ground. Bradley sat with the pressure and did not move. On the 8th minute, he found the 3rd position. It had been invisible in his initial scan, a natural fold in the terrain 260 yards to the northwest that he had categorized as irrelevant because it sat outside the standard threat radius for the direct approach. But it wasn't covering the direct approach. It was covering the lateral route, the same offset angle Bradley had used successfully 2 days earlier to avoid the secondary fire position. The Germans had anticipated his adaptation. The third position existed specifically to close the escape route his previous solution had opened. The trap had 3 walls now: the direct approach, the secondary position covering the lateral offset, and the tertiary position covering the adaptation he'd already demonstrated he was capable of making. 3 walls, which meant 1 opening. Bradley looked southeast, away from the casualty, away from every logical approach line. There was a section of ground running southeast to northwest that none of the 3 positions could cover simultaneously without compromising their own concealment. It was not a good route. It was longer, more exposed in terms of total distance, and required Bradley to approach the casualty from an angle that added roughly 90 yards to the total movement. It was the route that made the least immediate sense, which was precisely why the Germans hadn't bothered to cover it. They had built a trap for a man who moved efficiently. Bradley was about to move inefficiently on purpose. He waited 4 more minutes, not for the approach. He had already decided the approach. He was waiting for the German artillery cycle. He had tracked the pattern long enough to know that the battery covering the northeastern sector ran a predictable 8-minute interval between ranging adjustments. He needed the interval to open before he moved. If he entered the open ground during an active adjustment cycle, the tertiary position would have time to call a correction onto his route before he reached the casualty. At the 11th minute, the interval opened. Bradley moved southeast first, away from the casualty, which from any external observation point looked like a man retreating. He covered 30 yards southeast before cutting northwest along the uncovered corridor. He was now moving parallel to the German observation lines rather than across them, reducing his visible profile to the 3 positions to its narrowest possible angle. The approach added 90 yards to his total movement. It took longer. It looked wrong from every conventional perspective. The fire didn't come. He reached the soldier, a private from a forward rifle company. Femoral wound, significant blood loss, still conscious. Bradley worked fast. Tourniquet, stabilization, assessment, 90 seconds of treatment in the open before he began the extraction. He used the same northwest corridor on the return, the same southeastern exit, the same interval in the artillery cycle that was now closing behind him as he came back into cover. He returned to the forward position with the wounded man. No fire had found him, not because the Germans weren't watching, they were, but because the route Bradley had used had forced each of the 3 positions into a choice between breaking concealment to engage and maintaining their position for the next attempt. They had chosen to hold. They had calculated that Bradley had gotten lucky, found a gap by accident, and would return to more predictable movement on the next extraction. They were wrong about the accident. Bradley had mapped all 3 positions now. He knew where they were, how they were oriented, and what they were designed to prevent. The trap that had been built to end his operational effectiveness had instead handed him a complete picture of the threat architecture he was working inside. He had just used their plan to finish his own intelligence assessment. But knowing where the trap was set and surviving it under maximum pressure were 2 entirely different problems. And maximum pressure was exactly what was coming. March 2nd, 1944. The Germans launched a concentrated infantry push against the 3rd Division's forward positions before dawn. It wasn't a full offensive. It was a pressure operation designed to test the line, create confusion, and generate casualties in the open ground that had become, over 6 weeks, the most dangerous real estate on the Italian peninsula. It worked. Within the first 40 minutes of the engagement, 7 soldiers were down across 3 separate exposed positions. not clustered. Spread deliberately, 60 yards apart, 110 yards apart, 80 yards apart, in a pattern that ensured no single extraction could serve two casualties. Each position required a separate approach. Each approach crossed ground the Germans had been studying for 5 weeks. Bradley's aid bag had enough supplies for 4 men. He had no escort. The other forward medic had taken a shrapnel wound to the shoulder in the first exchange and was non-operational. The nearest support was 400 yards behind the line. He went out 7 times. The first extraction took 4 minutes. The second took 6. The casualty was larger, the wound more complex. The return route partially compromised by shifting fire. By the third movement, Bradley was running on a physical reserve that had no formal name in any training manual. He was operating on the accumulated output of everything he had observed, calculated, and survived over the preceding 6 weeks. He did not rush. That was the thing witnesses remembered afterward. 7 men down, limited supplies, no support, and Bradley moved with the same measured assessment he had applied on the first day. Each movement preceded by observation. Each route chosen not from instinct but from analysis. The pressure did not change the process. On the 7th extraction, the fire was the heaviest it had been all morning. Bradley reached the soldier, unconscious, chest wound, treated him in the open for 2 minutes, and carried him 130 yards back to cover without stopping. All 7 men survived. The after-action report filed the following day listed Bradley's actions in 4 sentences. Medical personnel performed forward extractions under fire. 7 casualties recovered from exposed positions. No medical personnel lost. 4 sentences. His commanding officer noted his performance in a separate memorandum. The word used was effective. Within the division, something shifted. Not loudly, not formally, but in the specific way that reputation moves through a unit that has seen enough to know what it witnessed. Men stopped not knowing his name. He was still Private First Class Jack Bradley. Same rank, same role, same aid bag. The ground at Anzio hadn't changed either. But the men who crossed it knew something now that they hadn't known in January, that if they went down out there, someone would come.